I am the president of the union that represents 9,000 service workers at the University of California system, all campuses and medical centers. Thank you. And the 15,000 patient care technical workers at the 5 medical centers and campus student health centers. And the last time I was in this building was about 18 years ago when I was a gardener here at San Francisco State, not knowing as I was watering the plants inside that I would at some point be in here talking about the neoliberal university and resistance to it. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I've got a lot of affection for this place. I can see the gardens that I planted, and they haven't ripped them out yet, so that's awesome. Where to start? So I want to talk about the university. It's actually really refreshing, and I shouldn't be surprised to hear the faculty up on the panel talking about the university basically as an employer, and I want to talk about that as well. But from the perspective of one who does work, whose work is not the mission of the university, right? Cleaning rooms, doing MRIs, caring for patients, cleaning the grounds. That's not the mission of a university. It's not why they exist. But the University of California is the 3rd largest employer in the state. And as such, they have a massive impact on the economy, the well-being, and honestly, ultimately, as I'll talk about, really how we move the ball either forward or backward down the field in regards to real equity and fighting racial injustice and other serious forms of oppression. So right now my union, as are 2 other unions, and now the graduate students, now a 4th, are in the midst of contract fights with the university. 3 of us actually are now no longer under contract, and we are going on strike on Monday. And it is no small thing. The word solidarity is very difficult to achieve in action. It's not too hard to issue a resolution, but to actually get the heads of unions to agree that we're all going to go out on strike together is a very difficult thing to achieve, because it happens not just in a vacuum, but in the context of a boss fighting you and working very hard to peel you off. You talked about the ways that they peel you off, between tenured and lecturer. Well, you magnify that among entire different job sectors, and it gets crazy, right? I will actually take this moment for a moment of shameless self-promotion for this strike. If you could just pass these out.
With great pleasure.
Thank you. I want you all to come to the picket lines. We have a lot to choose from. It's going to be a lot of fun. You're going to have a great time. So just real quick, some of the things we're fighting for. One, and these are the ways that, neoliberal agenda really kind of plays itself out. One is contracting out. My union issued a white paper in April that showed some basic things, no surprise. One is that the top administrative level now makes more than ever, and the gap between the top administrators and the frontline workers, the lowest paid workers, is wider than it ever has been. So 64% increase in the salaries of the top earners at the University of California. And they've proposed to hold wages flat for all the frontline workers currently bargaining. But more disturbingly is that it's not just that there's this gap, right? What we've also found, my union is predominantly women and people of color, overwhelmingly, disproportionately relative to the population of California. But the top administrative level of the UC is disproportionately white and disproportionately male. So when you have income disparity that way, you are also perpetuating racial injustice and around gender, etc. But disturbingly, we've also seen that, and I'll get into this in another workshop, the disparities in hiring, but that there is a 37% decline in the number of African Americans working at the University of California in the job titles we represent over the last 20 years. And you gotta ask, well, what's that about? Well, in a bargaining session, when we told the administration this across the table, they said, well, African Americans are simply not applying for the jobs. What our research found is that while the student population has totally ballooned at the University of California, and that's a very good thing, the number of employed service workers doing the work has barely budged over the last 20 years. It's hardly moved. But the number of people doing contracted work, who are hired through an outside contractor to come in and do the exact same jobs as service workers for up to $8.50 an hour less, are almost entirely people of color and far disproportionately Black workers. So essentially, because our work is not the mission of the university, and I realize it's not just because of that, because they treat you all like crap too, but we're not the mission of the university, so to hold labor costs down, the university, and for other reasons, has basically contracted out the work that used to be done by African American workers employed at the university, now done by African American contractors. They've pushed them down and out. So they've outsourced what were once jobs that were a ladder to a middle class living and jobs to stability. Precarity has led to actually greater impoverishment. Pension, and I know I got to speed this up real quick, another major thing in actually unifying demand of all three unions, the nurses, the professional technical workers, and my union, is pension. So the university is proposing a hybrid retirement plan where new workers can opt out of the pension and into a 401k. The regent that introduced this pension plan is a partner in a law firm that represents Fidelity, and Fidelity is the entity that administers the 401k at UC. So it's a massive cash cow for Wall Street, obviously. And the UC stands to lose $500,000 a year in this transition. On top of that, we've been fighting for transparency around the pension plan. We actually don't have a seat on the board, but the university some years ago made a decision to privatize the management of the pension fund, and that management decided to invest in hedge funds. We found that the pension fund has lost $2 billion due to fees and lack of investment performance. Now, who are the hedge fund managers? Robert Mercer is one of them. Mercer is one of the people driving the anti-union attack and is behind the Janus case that is designed to smash unions. So the public university is investing in hedge funds that send money to the pockets of the people that will smash the unions at the university. And so this is what the neoliberal machine at the third largest employer in California looks like. I'll wrap up with talking about resistance, and the university is a site for that. My union began in 1948. In 1950, janitors went on strike to do two things. One was to fight the McCarthyist loyalty oath, which they successfully defeated. And the second was to insist that the pension, which only the faculty at the time had access to, should belong to everybody. So these were the lowest paid African American in 1950 workers, janitors, who got and opened up the door for benefits for everybody. And they went on strike for 2 weeks to do that. 1972, Black dormitory maids went on strike for 10 weeks. Gosh, what was that strike for? Oh, that was to actually force the university, because they are not subject to labor laws in California, to force them to abide by the non-discrimination, anti-discrimination laws. 10 weeks, and they managed to win that fight as well. 1987, our union fought for 2 years against UCSF's English-only laws, or English-only rules, and we beat that. And that brings us up to today. We've had to strike every single contract round since 2005. And so we expect we'll be on multiple strikes this time around. Definitely encourage you to join us. The last thing I'll say is that the benefits, among the demands we've got, ban the box, local hire, no contracting out. these aren't just economic demands, they're also social justice demands, but this act of solidarity doesn't just win things for you, but it has the ability to absolutely transform the people who partake. So every time we go into organizing for a strike, as we are all this month, it's a process of people working through their fears if they've never gone on strike before, and finally being coaxed and encouraged to make it out to the picket line, and within minutes being on a picket line with their coworkers, feeling the liberation and the exhilaration of doing something in solidarity that they didn't know they could do before, and they were forever transformed. That is actually an incredibly powerful place for, I think, transforming the society that we live in, and I look forward to seeing you out on the line. Thanks. I'll just touch a little bit on what privatization for frontline workers looks like at a public institution, but then really I think the much deeper, more insidious impacts are of that, of privatization in a much more systemic way, and the implications for power. So there have been a lot of, not a lot, but there's been a lot of discussion and a couple studies put out about contracted out work and people who do contracting. SEIU published an important paper called Rape on the Night Shift, which highlighted the working conditions of predominantly women who are custodians in a lot of these contracting companies, and what their work lives and just lives were like working for a contractor, a low-wage contractor, without the benefit of a union and the ability to stand up and resist collectively the advances and attacks of their supervisors. That's one example. Closer to home where I work at UC Berkeley, and across UC, as I said earlier, there are potentially up to 7,000 people doing contracted work in the titles we represent. And at UC Berkeley a couple years ago, we had a huge fight to bring the contracted workers doing, parking the cars and doing custodial work and some athletics grounds work at the university, to bring them in-house, to make them employees of the University of California instead of ABM, one of the private employers highlighted in the report, Rape on the Night Shift, and last parking. It took 2 years and we managed to do it. We got every single one of those workers hired as employees at the university. Before that had happened, because a large number of them were immigrants, the employer took advantage of the fact that their preference and their preferred language is Spanish. Many of them may not have had mastery over English, may be new to the country, and not have the same support network that more established workers may have here. Did things like require them to work 2 shifts back-to-back, 16-hour days with no overtime pay, and then come in 6 hours later and do another 2 shifts. Some workers reported being told to, and in order to get around the overtime pay, they would be told to come in and clock in under a second name, a different name for their second shift. So using someone else's trumped up social security number, they were urged to bring their children in to work on weekends to get the work done because they could just be made to work for so much less. So, when we talk about privatization and its discontents, it's felt very personally and deeply in people's lives. But what I think is, and I'll kind of, without going through it very deeply, sort of what this means in terms of building middle class or tearing it down. Historically, unions have been really the ladder to the middle class for especially people of color and women in this country. But I also want to say that public institutions have been as well. There are plenty of private, no, I can't say that anymore. Unionization rates in private industry have absolutely plummeted. They are absolutely at the bottom. Certainly, though, there are represented unionized contractors, right? In fact, some of the the parking attendants that we brought in-house in Berkeley were represented by a union. They were making up to $8 an hour less than what they're making now as UC employees, but they had a union, right? I think that, on one level, when a public employer, a public institution, I'll say, is outsourcing the work, on a superficial level, they are trying to hold labor costs down, and they don't really care. It's like they're not in the business of managing custodial work. They don't want to think about it, let someone else do it, right? That's at a superficial level. But below that, when you have people who are hired at a public institution, one that is in one place, that is funded by taxpayers, that serves a public mission, and that workers can go into day in, day out and expect that they could potentially have a career there and retire from, there's a level of ownership that those workers can have over that institution, and in that mission, that if you are not employed by that institution, you don't have that level of ownership. You have a level of precarity. You don't know, you might still work for your private employer. You don't know if you're coming in to work at UC Berkeley that day or cleaning an office building in downtown Oakland, right? Or in Richmond for Chevron or whatever. So when you have people who have a feeling of ownership over their institution, then they begin to have a say. They begin to feel like they should have an influence. And if they are organized in their ownership, they in fact can have an influence. So when my union went lobbying 7 years ago around trying to basically set up a budget play to be able to fund our contract coming up, fundraisers for workers, we teamed up with the UC Student Association, who had a demand around scaling back and rolling back the fees that were proposed on students, and successfully, hand in hand. It was the first time that workers and students had walked in together with a common agenda and lobbied together, so that successfully we were able, 2 years later, to win wage increases for service workers, but we also held down fee increases for students because we weren't able to be divided. We had made common cause and we're not willing to be set against each other. But with that kind of ownership and investment in an institution, that's a lot more dangerous to people who are running the institution, who don't want a mass group of people to have a say over how it's run. So when we talk about privatization, in all its forms, even in the forms that we don't generally think about, right? Custodians and gardeners aren't noticed unless they're not doing their jobs, right? If you're not doing your job, people notice. And the whole point of it is to make sure no one knows what you're doing and no one sees what you're doing because you're doing it so well. But even at that level, privatization actually has the effect of removing mass ownership over the institutions that we fund and that have an incredible influence on the kinds of policies that are driven in this state or in the country, and the ways that we think, the ways that our kids are educated, what we're educated in. And when we resist that privatization, we're able to maintain a foothold and a place in owning the institutions that have such a massive impact on our society.